tests. So Xcode supports two types of tests, what they call application tests and what they call logic tests. Application tests are meant to test, among other things, your application's user interface or anything involving interaction, anything that would actually require that the simulator itself be fired up. Logic tests typically test your models. So per the spec for Project 2, you're officially only expected to write unit tests for your model classes, so that you're really just testing some of your low-level logic. And we'll look at both examples here, but you'll see that it's actually pretty easy even to test effectively the UI by simulating key presses and such, by manually invoking various IB actions, or specifically by calling the methods that should get called when you touch a button. And yet other frameworks exist for actually trying to test even more of the user interface. So we'll see two of these approaches here. So realize that when you check that box, when the template is first, when you're first prompted with the template, you get these things called application tests by default. So this is stuff generally involving your IB outlets and actions and such. If, however, I go to the File menu and do New and then Target, I can actually add some additional unit tests for this. What is a target? So this is not something, actually if you think back to makefiles, if you did take 50, recall that for many projects you didn't have a makefile, but when we finally introduced makefiles, we sometimes had multiple targets. The one P set where you had, we had a couple P sets where you would, trying to remember, make generate to generate the pseudo random number generator C program, and then make find, I think was the P set, even I don't really remember. But we had a makefile that had two targets inside of it, and anytime we gave you a makefile, we also had a third target or second target called clean. So anytime you typed make clean, what that was doing was looking in the makefile and executing specific commands to do the notion of cleaning. So Xcode has the same idea of targets. You don't see a makefile, you don't see it at the command line. Instead, you see a little drop down, and they're generally called schemes here. If we go up here to the top, almost always this thing only has the defaults. So if I check here, click here, I see Hangman, which is my one target, and then I can choose the actual device to simulate things on. But you can create other such targets so that you can run different commands on your code, in this case, tests. So let me go up to New, Targets. Let me, under iOS, choose Other. And then here, Cocoa Touch Unit Testing Bundle. And then click OK. I'll go ahead and name it in the following way. The convention that's generally recommended by Apple is to use the name of the application, which in this case would be Hangman, then say Logic Tests, or Hangman Application Tests, plural. I'll definitely use automatic reference counting still, and now I'll click Finish. And that's it. I just provide a name. And now notice on the left-hand side, I see a couple of things. One, I now have a new folder called Hangman Logic Tests. And down below that, I have an H file and an M file. Over here on the right, notice that I do indeed have new targets. I have my Hangman target, which represents my application. And I have my Hangman logic test, which represents the thing I just created. And this thing represents the result of my having checked the box when I first chose this template that said use add unit tests or whatever the text was. And now if I look under here, notice that I have two different schemes. This is slightly confusing in that we don't see Hangman tests under there, and that's just because how the template is configured. It doesn't give you a distinct scheme up there, so just FYI. So what do I then see? Well, if I look in the H file and the M file, I see this here in the H file, so that's great. There's not all that much to learn, but the framework that I promised existed in most languages, in this case is called CentTest, which is a framework that Apple adopted some years ago to actually make things easier. If you're familiar with CUnit, JUnit, C++ unit, almost all of these frameworks, except for this one, are something unit, where the something is the language's name. And then here in the M file are a bunch of sample methods that we might want to write. So here's how a unit test works in Objective-C and in many languages frameworks. One, there's a method generally called setup that allows you, the programmer, to do any kind of initialization that has to happen, allocating objects that you want to test, loading a database from which you need data, anything like that. And the teardown method does the opposite, frees memory if you need to in whatever language you're using, closes database connections, that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, you can write as many other methods as you want, so long as they start with the word test in lowercase, T-E-S-T, and then capital something. So test foo, test bar, test baz. Because later, when I click the run button up here, but first click and hold on it, and change it to the test button, as you can see here, what that will do is automatically run not my program per se, but my tests, and one at a time, it will execute setup and then test foo, then teardown, then setup, then test bar, then teardown, then setup, then test baz, then teardown. In other words, it's a heuristic. Any method whose name starts with test will get executed, but right before and right after, setup and teardown will get called. So you can sort of create a pristine state of the world in which to actually run your test. So let's actually now use this in the context of this ATM app, which originally had no tests. I did not check the box 2 weeks ago when we first created this. So I want to go in and start adding some unit tests. And let me go ahead and follow that same sequence of options. I'll go to File, New, Target. And then I'm going to choose Other, and then Cocoa Touch Testing Unit, Unit Testing Framework. Then I'm going to call this ATM Logic Tests. And then Finish. And now I get this folder over here of the code I just described. So in terms of the logic tests, you typically here want to test things like your models. So what is the model in question for the ATM application? Just to make sure everyone's on the same page. So the account. So how do I test the account object's correctness? Well, there's really nothing in the H file other than this property. And in the M file, there's this init method. So really, it would be nice to test one or both of those somehow. And what does it mean to test a property? Well, the property, because of @synthesize, really represents two methods, the getter and the setter. Now here too, it's probably pretty safe to assume that Apple is synthesizing correct getters and setters. So the init method is probably the one I should be suspicious about, because I wrote that, and I'm more likely to be wrong when it comes to the code that's been written. So how do we go about doing this? Well, let me go into my ATM logic test.m, and I might need to do some setup here. So if I actually want to do some setup, I could do something like this. Give me a pointer called account, and give me an account object, alloc, and then call init on it. But I'm going to have to do a couple of things here. This has given me, in my setup method, an account object, and a pointer there too. But my next method, let's call it down here. So notice this is called test example, and literally is meant to be example. Let's change that to test init. And let me go ahead and delete the sample code that's there. How do I go about testing my init method? Well, if my init method is correct, what should be true? Yeah, so my account.balance should be 0. So, and actually, let's be even more explicit here. I really want to test the balance of this account. So hopefully the thing is 0. But how do I access the account now? This is actually not right. I want to say something like if account.balance equals 0. I want to do success. Else I want to do failure. And we'll fix all this indentation. So how do I, this is wrong. Why?
Didn't you show a method to us in the text edit that shows like assert something equals?
OK, so good. So there is going to be some kind of assert method, but there's something just fundamentally broken about my code here, even though Xcode isn't yelling at me just yet. Yeah?
Account local variable with a setup method?
Exactly. So this is like CS 101 style stuff where I had created a local variable in the setup method, and that's not good enough because it's going to now go out of scope, and I have no access to this thing. So what's the solution here? What's that? So I could pass in the pointer, but be careful. The whole goal of the testing framework is that each method is going to be called in isolation. So setup should not call my test methods. They'll be called automatically. Yeah, so I could make it a property, or at least I could make it a instance variable. So how can I do this? Well, I'll do it sort of the fancy, arguably well-designed way, where I'm going to create an interface called the exact same thing, ATM logic tests, and it's a nameless category. And then I'm going to put n down here. And then in here, I can do property. Let's come back to the parenthetical in a moment. And I want a property that's a pointer to an account. And then down in here, I want to do synthesize, account, and back it with an instance variable called account. All right, now what should go in the parentheses here for this property? What 3 keywords are appropriate? What's that? OK, strong. Why?
Because you own this.
Good. I am going to allocate this as I do down here, so I should keep the pointer around with strong. What else?
Read.
OK, so read. Got to pick one. Read only or read write? So read write, otherwise I won't be able to set it at all. And what's the other one? Yeah, so non-atomic, which just means I'm not doing anything multi-threaded. So those are the three. There are defaults. Technically, we don't need read-write, but this will do for now. All right, so this is some kind of private property for now. Could also go in our header file per the chat earlier. But now I just have to change this to be what? Self.account. Exactly. All right, so now this is good. Now my setup method is actually going to create this object in memory, call alloc